General Hodges, thank you very much for being here. Good to see you on TV Rain again. First of all, there are bad news coming from the front, bad news for Ukraine. What do you see as the main reason for the failure of the counteroffensive, if the counteroffensive has failed, actually?
Well, two things. First of all, Ukraine has not failed. I think we in the West have failed. We failed to commit strategically to Ukraine winning, and therefore we have failed to deliver those capabilities that Ukraine needs and has expected that would enable the counteroffensive to be successful. And I'm talking specifically about long-range precision weapons that would be effective at making Crimea untenable for Russian forces, for example. But also just the psychological aspect. We have not said we want Ukraine to win. And so our failure and our wavering gives oxygen to the Kremlin, because the Kremlin's only hope is that the West will get tired.
And the West is getting tired?
Well, of course, we can't possibly be tired because there's not one American soldier or British soldier that's in Ukraine. Um, it's the inability of our leaders to explain to voters why this is important to us, that this is not some charity case or something happening far away, but this has direct implications for American security, American prosperity, and for deterrence of China. And so because of that, people don't understand, too many people don't understand why this matters to us. And so they become vulnerable to Russian disinformation.
Okay, so let me go back to the situation on the ground. You said recently that the United States would never send its soldiers on the offensive without achieving complete air superiority and without providing a huge amount of equipment. You have told me your opinion about the equipment of the West, but what is the reason that Ukraine did not receive aviation, which is crucial, right? This is the key moment that was missed.
Our failure to provide the F-16s, for example, as early as possible was a manifestation of our failure to commit to Ukraine winning. Those F-16s could have been there a year ago. Ukrainians could have been training on them, already be proficient. The infrastructure would already be in place. But instead, because we never committed to Ukraine winning, there was not the appropriate sense of urgency to deliver that capability. Same with ATACMS or the German Taurus or more British Storm Shadow.
Was it a mistake? Because I have read, as a lot of people did, maybe you did too, a huge article of Washington Post, which has actually tried to analyze what the mistakes were made during the counteroffensive. One of these mistakes, as they put it, is several directions of the counteroffensive. Would you agree that this was a mistake, that the main part of the attack should have been one direction?
Well, first of all, I was disgusted with those articles, not because they were poor journalism, but because this sounded to me like some in Washington, D.C. were trying to make excuses for why things had gone not the way we had hoped. And so I really was unhappy with what I heard coming from the Pentagon and from the White House. So as to whether or not the Ukrainian forces should have been focused on one area, I would defer to General Zaluzhny. The Ukrainian General Staff has done a good job for 2 years now. And I think that the arguing over whether or not there should have been one axis or two or three or whatever, that is a mask, or that masks the real issue, in that Ukraine did not have the capabilities it needed, and yet we expected. So whether they were all focused on one axis or two or three doesn't change the fact that we did not provide the breaching capabilities, the air power, and the long-range weapons that would have made any ground offensive more successful. Now, keep in mind that Ukrainian armed forces are conducting what we call multi-domain operations. So it's not just land, it's also air, sea, cyber, space. And I think if you ask the commander of the Russian Black Sea Fleet how their counteroffensive is going, I think he would say it's going very well for Ukraine. He's had to relocate 1/3 of his fleet out of Sevastopol because of what Ukrainian armed forces have accomplished.
Yeah, but it doesn't change the situation um, like crucially, right? What we can see right now on the ground is Avdiivka, and there are very hard, complicated, difficult battles near Avdiivka. Will there be a breakthrough for Russian army, in your opinion, at that direction? What to expect, in your opinion?
The Russians' only hope is that the West gives up. I mean, this continuous pressure for negotiations. Come on, let Russia have Crimea for the sake of peace. This is oxygen for the Kremlin. They can see that their strategy of a long war of attrition can work. And because they don't care how many of their own soldiers they lose, they're willing to just keep the pressure on places like Avdiivka. Um, but what I do not see the possibility of a breakthrough where Russian mobile forces could somehow break through and then keep moving towards Kharkiv or Kiev or other major Ukrainian population centers. I just don't see that capability. Of course, if Ukrainian forces run out of ammunition, that becomes a more dangerous situation. But I think that the Russian objective is really just about attrition and wearing down our will as well as Ukrainian forces.
So you're saying that there's not going to be a breakthrough from the Russian side, and obviously it's not going to happen from Ukrainian side. Does it mean that we will witness stalemate, I don't know, frozen conflict, whatever you call it, during indefinite amount of years, maybe? How do you see the prospects?
Of course, I don't know. I don't think that the Russians have, at least not now, enough mobile armored forces that could effectively penetrate Ukrainian lines in depth. There will be local successes probably in some places, just like Ukrainian forces achieved local successes in some places. But look, Russia is having to use artillery ammunition from North Korea, and my guess is that probably a half to 1/3 of that ammunition is not reliable. It's dangerous for the Russian artillery. And so the Russians also have logistics problems. I would hate to be a Russian soldier sitting in a trench because the logistics system is not going to deliver to those Russian soldiers what they need during the winter. And their leadership absolutely does not care how much they suffer. So I'm not prepared to say that Russia is going to win or is going to eventually break through. We know from history that war is a test of will. Um, Ukrainians need to, of course, the real pressure is on Ukraine, but they need to know that the West is behind them as well. And so I hope that my president and other Western leaders will explain to all of our populations why this is in our benefit that Ukraine is successful.
Yeah, but right now, Vladimir Zelensky is in Washington meeting with President Biden, you have just mentioned. Do you think that realistically there would be some attempts to push Ukraine towards the negotiations with Russia?
Of course, there are people that are calling for that, um, but I don't know that. I mean, whenever somebody talks to me about Ukraine should negotiate, I would always ask, well, what do you think will happen after any negotiation? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Ukraine agreed and there was negotiation and Russia was allowed to keep whatever it has now. What do serious people really think happens after that? There is zero evidence in history of Russia ever living up to any agreement it's ever made. There is no chance, in my view, that Ukraine could successfully rebuild its economy as long as Russia occupies Crimea and is able to block access up into Azov Sea. and continue to be able to disrupt Odessa and Kherson and Mykolaiv seaports. So why? I mean, why does anybody think that this will be the end? That there will be peace after that? And I think Ukrainians know what happens in occupied territories. And I think our Eastern European allies understand what happens in occupied territories. So I think I see no positive outcome for any kind of negotiated settlement where Russia remains in control of what it has now.
I would also like to ask you about the condition of Russian army, because we talk a lot about the Ukrainians, but we talk less about Russians. We saw a serious defeat of Russian army last year, and we have discussed it on air, General Hodges. How did they manage to stabilize the situation, in your opinion, and even, you know, gain some advantage maybe over Ukrainian army? What did they do?
I think three things accounted for this. Number one, it was our failure to deliver capabilities on time, which allowed Russia to build up their defenses. Now, we have to give the Russians credit. They did not waste the time that they had last summer to build up the trenches, the minefields, all the different obstacles. Um, that was one thing that I think gave them that created the situation we're in now. The second thing is, again, in a autocratic country or a dictatorship like Russia, where the leader does not have to worry about journalists asking hard questions, or people voting him out of office, or the Duma asking difficult questions. He doesn't care about the number of casualties they suffer. Then they're able to just keep pouring troops into the meat grinder. That even though they're losing hundreds killed every day, they still are able to drag in more people to keep doing that. So those are the things I think that have contributed to the situation as it is now. And finally, the third thing, I think, even as General Zaluzhny has said, we should not underestimate Russia's ability to adjust, to make corrections, even though they cannot change the culture of their armed forces. And thankfully, they have still not figured out how to destroy convoys bringing equipment and ammunition from Poland into Ukraine. And the Black Sea Fleet has been defeated by Ukraine, even though Ukraine does not have a navy. They still have figured out, particularly in the area of drones and drone technology, that has changed the balance.
Just, you know, to clarify a little bit the outcome of the visit of Zelensky to Washington, you said that he would be pushed towards negotiations. Do you mean that Joseph Biden himself, the president of the United States, is interested in this kind of direction of negotiations?
I don't know that, but I keep hearing comments from spokesmen and people from the administration talking about how they want Ukraine to be in the best possible position for negotiations. So that's what I mean. That's the problem. The president never says we want Ukraine to win. It's in our interest that Ukraine ejects Russia to the 1991 borders. He never uses those words. He always talks about we're with Ukraine for as long as it takes, which I think is an empty statement. Or I heard a spokesman just yesterday, I read it, where he said, we want Ukraine to have the best possible negotiating position. So that tells me that the administration is, of course, looking for a negotiated settlement.
When Ukrainian officials say so, because they do keep on declaring that their mission is to go back to the borders of 1991, do you think this is realistic?
It is realistic, of course, if we commit to it. I mean, that's the point. People are wringing their hands and saying,
is there still a chance, General? I mean, do they still have an opportunity? Do they still have a time?
Yeah, of course they do. Look, this is the United States. We have not even gotten serious about production of equipment and ammunition yet. When we get serious about it, then all of a sudden, all the excuses about ATACMS and Abrams tanks and Bradleys and F-16s, all those excuses go away. So Look, you know what I think about what the Allies did in World War II. The first 3 years of the war, from September 1939 until the middle of 1942, it was disaster, disaster, disaster. The German forces, Japanese forces, Italian forces were defeating the Allies over and over and over and over for 3 years. And then finally, in the middle of 1942, the Allies began to achieve victories, began to stop. But it still was 3 more years of war before it was over. How come? Why are we talking about fatigue and we're not even physically in the war? I mean, we have not done any of the things necessary to help Ukraine win. So I'm not willing to say there's no way that Ukraine can win. Of course there is, if we get serious, if we make that our priority.
Well, when they talk about fatigue, as I understand, the idea is that the voters in the West, including the United States of America, are tired of spending money on something that is very, far, far away from them. They don't understand that it is important for themselves, and they are demanding to spend money for their own needs, like the needs that are here right now. And, this is my last question. Do you expect that this $61 billion package will be delivered to Ukraine in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, I do. Eventually it will, because actually most members of Congress support Ukraine. I mean, most on the Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, most people actually do. And I think the administration has been not been very clever. They could have made a negotiation on the border, U.S. border, much sooner. And so this was not skillful by the administration in dealing with the Congress. They knew that there was opposition. I think they could have been much more skillful in these negotiations. Look, we spent 20 years in Afghanistan, $2 trillion. All right. So American people can put up with things for a long time if they understand why it's important. And so the burden is on the administration to explain why this matters to us.
Well, let's see. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for the privilege.
Good to see you. Thank you. TV Rain has started broadcasting in English so that you could get news about Russia, the war in Ukraine, and Russian society directly from the source.
Russia's military is unable to stop Ukrainian forces.
The Kremlin's newest propaganda target is now the LGBT community.
TV Rain channel has been shut down in Russia many times. The last one happened at the beginning of March, when the war started.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We survived, started working from Europe, and now we are watched by millions of people every day, for whom we are the only TV station that tells the truth about the war. Subscribe to our English channel TV Rain Newsroom on YouTube.